So we talked about doing this for a long time because I'm in a very fortunate position now that I get to travel a lot, everywhere really, mostly at either really lovely literary festivals where it's all full of writers and people who like writing, or bookshops. 95% of the bookshops I go to are kind of independent bookshops because that's where publishers send you to sort of show the love to the independent sector. And it's fascinating going around the United States and Europe, UK and Australia and Asia, going into all of these different independent bookstores because they're all run by slightly quirky characters. And because only a quirky character bookshop, and they're all very interesting people, and every single bookshop as well, independent bookshop, also has a group of loyal community people from the community that come to them, and that's why it's lovely to go to them, because wherever I go, you know, I'll end up in towns where I don't think anyone's interested in China, old or new, and where no one's particularly interested in me particularly, but they come out and they support the bookshop. And that's kind of really fantastic, and you know, it's always amazing to see. And I have to tell you, the good news is, I think, is certainly true that in certainly the UK and the US, independent bookstores are doing better than they have done for the last few years. So the actual, you know, provable revenues at independent bookstores were up in America quite significantly, and also in the UK. And it's one of the few sectors that are actually opening shops. There are more independent bookstores now than there was 2, 3, 5, certainly 10 years ago. So the day of the big chain has gone, and the small chain and the independent is kind of doing it. And they're holding up very well against our friends at Amazon. And the ebook thing seems to have plateaued. Most authors that I know, like me, are not seeing any growth in their e-revenues. I mean, it's just growing in line with your sales. Audio is doing very well, but it's so the time of the independent bookstore is really now, and the community bookstore, and all of them are all wonderful. They're all tied in with local craft breweries and wine dealers and local confectionery manufacturers and bakers. I mean, everywhere you go, you get wonderful treats going into bookshops, and they're all great, and they're all run by real characters. And the other reason that it's nice to be here is if you think that people who run independent bookstores are quirky characters, you should meet independent publishers. And if you want to meet really quirky independent publishers, you should come to Asia, because it's probably one of the most difficult places to be an independent publisher in terms of the number of outlets you've got and everything else. So I had known Pete Spurrier here at Blacksmith Books for quite a long time. I'd always thought it would be lovely to do something together, you know, but I wasn't quite sure what the right sort of book and the right sort of product to do with it was. Imagine being an independent publisher in the UK or the US has a very hard time. The big publishers are not just big publishers, they're parts of enormous media conglomerates now. And they control what goes in the window at bookshops, they control what goes on the tables, they control what gets reviewed in the newspapers, they control everything as much as they can. And it's very, very difficult to break through that. And of course, here in Asia, particularly with Pete's business, even more difficult to break through, because you've got Hong Kong, but then, you know, you're trying to sell books that have a China interest, and China has got, you know, all the censorship hoops you've got to jump through, and then not many bookshops to sell to, and very conservative buying practices at those bookshops. So really difficult and really tough to sort of find a way through it. So independent bookstores and independent publishers are all wonderful people. But I wouldn't necessarily want my sister to marry one. But they're all really fantastic, and it's great to be able to work with them. And obviously, I'd come to Hong Kong for many, many years, and in recent years, due to friends that moved here, I'd been coming into Mui Wo and around here. So I'd seen obviously the changes in the bookshop, and I thought, like, wouldn't it be nice? And Phil at RTHK, who drags me onto his radio show every so often, thought, wouldn't it be nice to come and do something? So community bookshops, independent bookshops survive, and I get book sales through so many community and independent bookshops because people come out and support events like this. So thank you very much for coming, because it's a really important resource in the community. Having said that, I'll talk a little bit about what I do. I've sort of ended up in a what I think is a very nice space. because I never thought when with the usual route of Chinese at university, some time studying Mandarin in Shanghai, and then back to do a sort of proper job in China for a long time, and eventually spent another 23 years in Shanghai, unbelievably. Somehow that 23 years went past. And I was always working on history, Chinese history, and I always wanted to sort of tell Chinese stories, and I was particularly fascinated in the stories of the foreign community that had lived, particularly in Shanghai, where I lived all of my China time. I mean, I really am a Shanghai guy, despite the fact I'm best known for Beijing, which really does annoy some people in Beijing who are trying to publish books that a Shanghai guy should end up doing the book on Beijing that everyone reads. But I always wanted to tell the stories of the foreign community in China, because 1949, the bamboo curtain came down, and we kind of lost our collective generational memory of the foreigners that had been in Shanghai, and to a lesser extent in Beijing and elsewhere in China. And, you know, places that were really, really important before 1949, the most advanced city in Asia in many, many ways, Shanghai, and the great intellectual scholarly capital of Beijing, slightly fell off our radar, and up came, you know, what the Shanghainese would have called in the 1930s, that dingy little port to the south, full of English soldiers getting drunk and going marauding if you didn't die of some sort of horrible disease first, which you know as Hong Kong. And Hong Kong, you know, of course, at that period couldn't have held a candle to Shanghai in terms of the nightlife, the culture, the modernity of it. So I was always fascinated with these two places. On the one hand, you had Beijing, which stood for the aesthetic of China, and that's why people like Harold Acton and Desmond Parsons and the great British aesthetes went to Beijing, because that was where, you know, the culture was. It is China's, well, we don't hear it much now, but it is China's Rome. It is the center of religions and belief systems in China. It is one of the longest running historic capitals of the city, and the scholarly center of China. Shanghai, I love for a different reason. It's because of modernity. It was the city of the avant-garde. It was the city of, the basic stuff, like the first place to have lifts and central heating and telephones in hotel rooms and all that kind of cool stuff, neon signs and jazz clubs and all of that we all love about Shanghai. But it was also a place of great culture as well. Now, even though the term Hai Pai, the East-West notion of Shanghai, was invented as an insult by the Beijing intellectuals who believed that Jing Pai, the Beijing culture, was a much superior culture, of course the Shanghainese turned the term Hai Pai to their advantage and argued that that's what they were going to do. And I'll come back to Shanghai. I started out kind of really just writing on weekends, like everybody does, scribbling things together, and published several books down here actually with Hong Kong University Press, with whom I still have a good relationship. And they were the kind of books about foreigners in China. I did one on a guy called Carl Crow, who was an American advertising guy who came to Shanghai in 1911, created the first Western advertising agency in China. And if you know the Shanghai Calendar Girl adverts, with all the women in beautiful Cheongsam, he created that concept on the grounds that you could not sell clothes, fashion to the Shanghainese. They didn't need to be told anything about fashion. They had their own fashions. What you could sell them was cosmetics and permanent wave kits and things like that. So if you look at those posters, it's all beautiful Cheongsams, and it's all then women with shorter bobbed curly hair and rouge and lipstick, and that's largely what they were selling. And so the tradition of the Calendar Girl poster, now very collectible of course, really started with Crow. So I wanted to write about him, but that's a rather esoteric sort of interest. And then I wanted to do a history of foreign journalists in China, and I think because I had been reading so many reports from foreign journalists in the really from the Opium Wars through to the Second World War, and also because the work I was doing in market research and advertising and so on, I would constantly get people saying, China is the big story. China is the only story. All we think about is China. And I was like, Well, actually, if you do an analysis, which I kind of rather boringly did, of the major newspapers, international newspapers, the number of column inches devoted to China now and over the last 20 years since I did that book is significantly less than it was from the late 19th century through to the Second World War. There was more written about China. China now is a sort of reasonably interesting story, depending on what part of the world you sit in. But it's a business story by and large. I mean, now there are some political issues, but it's a business story. It's a trade wars story. The China of the first half of the 20th century was much, much more than that. The story about China in the first half of the 20th century was, will China even continue to exist as a country? Or will it just break apart into warlord-controlled territories? You know, will the Canton government split off from the Beijing government? Will Manchuria just be taken over by warlords? Will whole areas of the country just go off, or will it become a federal country? What are the actual definitions of the size of China? And these were all massive questions in the 1920s, and they're much, much bigger questions than we kind of think about now. So please, you can go and buy books. You can wander through and buy books, don't worry. Yeah. So I really wanted to write about those interesting characters that came, but also to talk about how we should kind of get China in perspective, and we should understand that the China that we deal with now is a result of all of that process, but also in a sense, in many ways, not quite as interesting, not quite as globally pivotal as it perhaps was, of course, in the Second World War. It is where the Second World War starts, after all, in 1937. So I was doing that, and I was doing it on weekends, and it was being published, and I was sort of interested in that, and I was looking into the lives of foreigners in Shanghai and Beijing. I mean, I should explain I had a family interest, which was that my great-grandfather was with the Royal Navy in Shanghai in the 1920s, running the coaling station for the Far East Squadron that went from Hong Kong up to Shanghai, and Shanghai up to Weihai Way, and a little bit up the Yangtze, and patrolled that route. And he controlled the coal supply so they could read coal. And when I was a young child, and I'm sort of giving my age away now, obviously to you I appear to be in my late 20s, but in actual fact, in the 1970s, when I was a young man, a young kid, in the early 1970s actually, I used to go to Tottenham in North London, where my great-grandfather lived. And because he had worked in coal and coaling and shoveling coal in through the First World War, he shoveled coal, he had the most enormous arms, and obviously he could sort of balance these trays on there and everything. And there's a funny thing about English people. Well, reading the news at the moment for the last few months, there's a lot of funny things about English people, but there's some of them not so funny. But there's a funny thing about English people, which working class people, which is you have a house and it has a nice living room and maybe another room, but you never go into it, except at Christmas or funerals, right? And you spend your entire life in a little tiny room at the back of the house, drinking tea and eating biscuits, and drinking tea out of a saucer quite often, which is even more weird, which is what they used to do. And we would all sit out there in the summer, and my great-grandfather would have a vest on, you know, he didn't wear a shirt, and on both of his hands he had a dragon's head tattooed. And then the dragon went all the way up both arms and then crossed at the back, and down between his shoulders the tails crossed, and it went all the way down his back to the sort of crack of his arse. It was an enormous tattoo at a time, I might add, when it wasn't the case that every idiot with a beard had a tattoo at that time, right? You know, like now everybody has a tattoo, but at that time only really sort of soldiers, sailors and boxers had kind of tattoos. So I was always fascinated by this, and I would always, and it was still, because he had such big arms, it was such a big tattoo. And I'd say, oh, great-granddad, where did you get that tattoo? And he would say, Shanghai. And then he would wink like that, at which point my great-grandmother, who was fairly tough as well, would lean over and just hit the back of his head like that. And I never understood that, right? Because later I understood that wink meant that was the best time of my life. It was the most pleasant place I ever went. And perhaps you should go and find out if it's quite as amazing. So that was kind of how I got into, I mean, that's a rather odd route to ending up doing 5 years of Chinese at university, but it's sort of, that's kind of what happened. And I never got a tat either, because I could just never match that level of tattooing. so I was always interested in these people. But of course, after 1949, we forgot them. We largely kind of forgot these people. And then when we all went back to do business again in the 1980s and so on, and the first sort of groups of students like me went in the 1980s to China, we kind of had lost that entire world. But I was very lucky when I went to Shanghai in 1987 that because Deng Xiaoping very cleverly decided that as you opened up the country, the last place you should open up would be Shanghai. Because of course, if he'd opened up Shanghai first, it would have swallowed everything, right? And with its networks down here, right? Remember Tung Chi-hua and people, they're all Shanghai families down here, the big families, and in Singapore and elsewhere, they would have just swallowed everything up and there would have been nothing left for anyone else. So he left it till last. So when I turned up in 1987, it was as if a dust sheet had been thrown over the city in not 1949 exactly, but about 1952, 53. And nothing had changed. Pudong didn't really exist at that point. Well, it existed, but not in the way it is now. And it was just, you know, mile after mile after mile of low-level, one-story Shikumen, Lilong, and Longtang housing. And even at that point, Beijing was, again, you know, I mean, 1949, Beijing had 4,500 hutongs. Now Beijing has less than 300 hutongs. And not one of those is pristine. They've all got gaps in them. So, you know, but when I went to Beijing, I think there was something like 2,800, which felt like a lot at the time. So, you know, just miles and miles of them stretching away. So, so obviously that kind of got me interested in who lived in these places and so on. So I did a few books and I decided that was quite good. And then I thought I need a new challenge. So I thought what I want to do is I want to kind of do a book that takes Chinese history and a Chinese story to a much, much wider audience. That kind of, by using a really good story, and I think crime is a really good story because if you go in any bookshop in the world and every culture in the world really, everybody reads crime books, right? It's always the biggest genre in everywhere, on TV, in bookshops, everywhere. So I thought let's find a really good crime story that by luring people in to read a crime story, they will get a Chinese history lesson. They just won't know that they've had a Chinese history lesson. They'll think they're just reading a crime book. And I looked around for quite a long time. And in fact, I started work on City of Devils because my other aim was I wanted to do the like 1930s Shanghai book to end all 1930s Shanghai books. I wanted to like just draw a line under 1930s Shanghai and say, now no one can ever do a better book on 1930s Shanghai. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. It's going to have on one hand, it's going to have the gangsters and the girls and the jazz and the opium and everything. And on the other hand, it's also going to deal with how crappy the situation was in the city and how tough it was to live there. And we're going to do the whole thing, and then the Japanese are going to come in, and that's just going to be it, right? No one's ever going to touch the subject again. They'll be too scared. And I started work on that. But of course, old Shanghai is such a massive subject. I ended up with just pages and pages and pages. At one point, I came across the story of the murder in Peking in January 1937 of Pamela Werner, and the fact that this murder had never been solved. And I thought, you come across lots of stories, and some of them go in the South China Morning Post Sunday magazine, and some of them get lost, and some of them get worked up into something for Destination Shanghai. Others become books. And I pulled and pulled and pulled at this thread of Pamela Werner. And it got better and better. So I found out that she was murdered, and it was a horrible murder, but that it had never been solved. And I thought, well, unsolved murder is a really major thing for us to sort of deal with in all cultures and societies. The idea that murder should go unpunished is a very emotional one. Secondly, the case, of course, because it was Beijing, came to Inspector Han Sheching, who was the head of detectives for the Beijing city at that time. But because it was a foreigner and because there was a British policeman in the British concession in Tianjin who was Scotland Yard trained, he was brought over and the two worked together. And I know of no other instance before or after where a British and a Chinese detective worked together to try and solve a murder. So this is a really good example of sort of, you know, Sino-British understanding. And if we all work together, won't it be great? Of course, as it works out in history of trade as well as in crime, working together, they didn't manage to solve it. So it doesn't necessarily help if you work together. Though, of course, the Japanese invasion of China had that, which was the other element that I wanted, which was the investigation hits a brick wall because in July that year, the Japanese invade the city. And for me, July the 7th, 1937, when Japan moved down from Manchuria and invaded and occupied Peking and Tianjin, is really the start of the Second World War, because after that, of course, that's July. By August, they're attacking Shanghai. In September, of course, we have the horrific rape of Nanjing and the Chinese government moving to Chongqing and the move down to the south of China by the Japanese. At that point, of course, Japan is going to then clash in Indochina with the French and in Hong Kong with the British. And that will be the two empires. And then if they're dealt with, as of course we know they were, with the fall of Singapore and the fall of Hong Kong, then it will be two great powers facing each other across the Pacific, Japan and the United States. And we know that on the 8th of December 1941, Pearl Harbor, of course, then we're into a full war. But that process starts, I think, on July the 7th, 1937. And I wanted to get that across to readers around the world. In Europe, you know, we all think it's September 1939. America, they all think it's December 1941. And I wanted people to understand that the war starts in July 1937 in China. And that China fought nearly 9 years of war against Japan. You know, nearly a decade of total war against the Japanese. So, and I also imagine that would be a book that would be about all of this going on. Detectives working together, the world of Peking at that time, the hutongs, the traditional life of Peking, and the foreign community that had this rather lost to history area called the Badlands of Peking, which is not a very big area compared to the sort of Badlands of Shanghai, which is half the city by 1940. But there was an area where foreigners sold drugs, dealt drugs, drank, prostitution, all the rest of it, and that had kind of been left out of the history book. So I thought that'll be good and we'll be fine. And then I was in London trying to research all the last bits of the case. And I was in the National Archive, the UK National Archive in Kew, and I was looking through boxes of things. And now, I mean, they have done an incredible job at Kew of trying to digitise the British Archive, which is every piece of paper that's ever been through the British government, and every embassy and consulate and law court and everything is in that one archive. So they're digitising and digitising, but they have priorities. So basically the priorities start from anything with a signature that says Churchill on it gets digitised first, and then you move down from there, right? And I was looking, so there's still tons and tons of boxes that are just full of papers that no one's got around to digitising. They're just down in the 7 floors of basement that they've got there. And there was a box there that said British Consulate General, because of course after 1927 Beijing was not the capital, it was Nanjing, so it wasn't an embassy, it was a consulate. 1942. And I thought, well, that's really interesting because, like, who is in the British consulate in Beijing, the former British embassy in Beijing, sending out paperwork in 1942? Oh, they've either left or they've now been interned in Japanese internment camps. So who's in the embassy? So I called it up, and actually all the paperwork and literally a box of dust comes up. I have a picture of it somewhere that no one's ever looked at because it's never sort of seemed relevant. And on top of it was various sheets of paper. It was these endless letters from a Chinese guy who, before Pearl Harbor, had been paid to dry clean the curtains of the British embassy, right? And then Pearl Harbor had happened, and all the British had either left or been arrested by the Japanese to take for internment. And he hadn't been paid. So he was writing letter after letter to the British embassy saying, I cleaned your curtains, right? I've returned your curtains, where's my money, right? And of course there's no one to reply to him. So somewhere out there is still a Chinese family that hates the British because we never paid for our curtains, dry cleaning of our curtains. So I sort of waded through that and I thought, oh, this is hopeless. This is just going to be a load of bad debts that were caused. And then in there was about a 150-page document from Pamela's father, who had been a former diplomat in China and was a great sinologist in his own right, E.T.C. Werner, Edward Werner. And he had tried to investigate the murder. And when I went back and cross-referenced and tried to use the work that I'd got, the autopsy report, the police reports I had, the newspaper reports, the various, I mean, I was researching that book around 2010, 2011. So at that time, I was still able to find about 6 or 7 people who had been to school with Pamela, who were then in their late 80s and early 90s, who had recollections. So I did have some primary sources. And I think he got the right answer. So the book is really what happened during the police investigation, what happened at the murder and what happened during the police investigation, and then a switch, because obviously Inspector Han was a high-level member of the Kuomintang, and as soon as the Japanese came, he had to disappear. Inspector Dennis, who was the British policeman, as soon as Tianjin was invaded, had to go back to organise the defence of the British concession of Tianjin. And the father investigated the case, and I think he came to the right conclusion. Now, if you go on the internet, you'll know that there's lots of people who think I'm wrong, and that the father murdered her, and that lots of other people did it. And I think they all have their own motivations for that. Some of it is just nuts conspiracy theories. Some of it is to do with people being upset about things I might have said about their relations. Which I sort of stand by. I mean, I'm sorry, if you've got a horrible grandfather, you've just got a horrible grandfather, and that's just what it is. But other people kind of embraced it. I mean, there's one character in there who's British, who worked for the Japanese, and when he got on a boat and went back to Britain, he was arrested under what was called Regulation 18B, which was if you'd sympathised with the Nazis or the Japanese, you were arrested and placed in an internment camp in Britain, actually at Aintree Racecourse in Liverpool. That's where he spent the rest of the war. And I got contacted by his family who said, oh, we didn't really know that. Because after the war, he emigrated to Australia. And I got the granddaughter who said, well, he was just my lovely grandfather. And I know he was in China, and then he never talked about the war much. And I was like, okay. So I think if you're British, there isn't really anything worse than being told there's a Nazi in the attic in your family, right? It's like, it's the absolute worst, right? I mean, there's like, you can't think of anything worse. I mean, I do have my son has a father-in-law who's a Brexiteer, and that's pretty bad. But to have an actual, convicted Nazi in the family is quite bad. So they sort of were quite angry about it for a while, but I did what I do with everyone when they contact me about their family members. I just document dump on them and say, look, just read all of this in chronological order and see what conclusion you come to. And they've actually embraced it, and they're now writing a biography of their pro-Nazi, pro-Japanese grandfather, which I'm sort of quite looking forward to. But for a while they were resistant. Now they've embraced it. So that sort of happens. Anyway, that book did. I mean, I guess my original theory of how do you write a book that everyone in the world will read and will give them a Chinese lesson, but will be a good story, kind of worked. And so everybody kind of liked it. And in fact, there was so many people contacted me who either had been in Beijing at that time as children and remembered the case and had little facts about the case, or were relatives of various people that were mentioned in the book, or had information on people that were in the book, that I ended up doing another book called The Badlands, which was really just short stories built up from all the information that came into me. And this is like one thing I'll talk about in a minute, which is just the amount of stuff I now get from people whose families were in China kind of will keep me busy, until they cart me off to an old people's home somewhere. I mean, I've got enough material now from all of these people, photographs, letters, everything that gets sent to me. So I got, once you do a book like that, and it comes out sort of all around the world, and it does very well and wins a couple of awards, so it gets a lot of attention, everything comes out the woodwork. And I hadn't really been expecting that. All of these people come and they start sending you photos and they tell you little stories. One woman said to me, oh, you talk about one person in the book and you don't quite know what happened to them. And I'm like, no, I don't really know what happened to them. We thought they might be involved, they weren't. And they went, oh, don't you understand? They were the owner of this nightclub. They just never told anyone about it. It was a silent ownership. And this was a 93-year-old lady in Sydney, Australia. And I just said, like, you're the only person that knows that piece of information. That piece of information only exists in your head. There's no paperwork left in China to prove it. It's just something that she told me. But she read the book and just sort of assumed everybody knew this, right? And I'm just like, no, you're the only person left living who knows it. So I got that. So then I thought after that, I better go back to the Shanghai book I was doing, which now had become the tricky second album kind of thing, right? After the success of the first one. And I wanted to go back and do that story. And I realized that, first of all, I thought I could do a kind of Berlin Alexanderplatz thing where you do a book where the city is the character and real people are not that important. And I think Shanghai is good enough, it's a good enough city for that. And I wanted to tell all the stories of the people that came to Shanghai in the 1930s and 40s, but all the stories of the people that came to Shanghai in the 1930s and 40s, which I did tell, turned out to be a kind of 5,000-page manuscript, which, funnily enough, Penguin were not that happy to receive and just sort of sent it back to me and went, you've got to drill it down. So I did. And I ended up with two guys who I thought really summed up foreign Shanghai in the 1930s. And obviously I don't want to tell stories about missionaries or businessmen or diplomats. It's all about the slightly recherche kind of underworld people that went to China. And it was about a guy called, and of course no one in Shanghai ever has their real name. It is the only city in the world where you can just get off a boat and you don't need a passport or a visa. I mean, you know, Casablanca is an invention of Hollywood. Shanghai was the only city where you could do this. And he called himself Joe Farron, but his real name was Josef Pollack. He was from the Jewish ghetto of Vienna. He was a very good dancer, and he met a woman. He went on a tour of Asia, showing people in Singapore and Hong Kong and everywhere how to waltz and do the different dances. And he met a white Russian emigre woman, and she changed her name to Nellie Farron, although I can't actually prove they ever got married. And they toured together as a couple, dancing, a sort of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers of Asia. And Joe had a dream that he could build the biggest nightclub and casino that the world had ever seen. And he did. At the time that he built Farron's nightclub in the west of Shanghai, it was the single largest nightclub and casino in the world. It was 6 floors. It had more roulette tables than Monte Carlo. It had more slot machines than Reno at that time, which was just getting going. Las Vegas was still just desert. It was phenomenal. But he needed someone to bankroll it, and he met a guy who was called Jack Riley, who certainly was not born Jack Riley. Jack Riley was a character who had been in the US Navy and had been out to Shanghai with the US Navy, had gone back and got caught up in J. Edgar Hoover's war on the public enemies. He'd been given 35 years for a kidnapping in Tulsa. But he was a good baseball player because he'd been in the US Navy baseball team. And when the baseball team went out to play in the local town at McNeil in Oklahoma, where the Oklahoma State Penitentiary is, everybody went back into the prison, turned right to go back into the prison. Jack turned left, jumped on a train, managed to get to San Francisco. Now, he knew he wanted to go back to Shanghai, but he needed to do certain things. So the first thing he did was he mugged a drunk on the Embarcadero in San Francisco who happened to be called Jack Riley, and he thought, that's a good name. There's 100,000 Jack Rileys in America. There must be 200,000 around the world. So he changed his name to Jack Riley. He then threw his passport away and burnt it so that they could never prove that he was American. Because, of course, if you were in Shanghai, you were in extraterritoriality. So the only law you could break was the law of your own country, not the law of China. So he knew that if you can't prove that someone was an American or someone was British, you couldn't prosecute them. They were scot-free, as they say. I know the Scots don't like that term, so I shouldn't really use it. They were completely free. And he did that. But then just to make sure, he bought acid. And he sat in a hotel room and he put each of his fingers in acid and he burnt his fingerprints off. He burnt his fingerprints off on all of it. This was a quite common thing. John Dillinger did it and various other ones did it. And he burnt the fingerprints off. And then he got on a boat and went to Shanghai. And when he got to Shanghai, he realized that there were no laws against anything in Shanghai, really. Right? It was the sort of uber, super capitalist place on earth. Right? I mean, it was legal, prostitution was legal, opium smoking was legal within certain restrictions. There were no licensing hours. There was none of this Anglo nonsense about closing bars or anything like that. So and the one thing he noticed was that nobody had ever come up with the idea of slot machines in Shanghai, right? Because the British had never seen, who largely controlled Shanghai, had never seen slot machines. They were already in America, but the British had never seen them. So he starts shipping them over via his Navy mates through the Philippines. And at one point, he had 100,000 slot machines across the whole of Shanghai, everywhere. And everybody wanted to use them. All the soldiers, sailors, the 4th Marines, everyone was just feeding coins into them. And, of course, the Chinese, who, you know, so rumour says, like to gamble now and again, love them as well. They called them dime-eating tigers. So he was all through the French concession, the international settlement, and Chinese Shanghai. He had these everywhere, and he was making phenomenal amounts of money. And what Joe needed to get his club up and running, Joe ran chorus lines, he ran dance halls, he had the entertainers, he made everything look slick, span. He was called the Ziegfeld of Shanghai. I mean, dapper Joe, very stylish. He needed someone who could bankroll a massive casino. And he got Jack Riley to bankroll the casino. And there is the story of how they built the biggest casino in the world, but of course, how the two of them it's not going to end well particularly. It doesn't end well largely because just as they were about to open, the Japanese attacked Shanghai. And so we go into this weird, fascinating historical period in Shanghai, which the Chinese call Gudao, or the lonely or solitary island period, which is the Japanese have, of course, taken over everything around Shanghai, and they've moved up to Nanjing and throughout the rest of the Yangtze Valley. So there's no way out of Shanghai. But they don't invade the international settlement and the French concession because, of course, to do that would mean to go to war with France, Britain, America, and Japan is not ready to do that in 1937. So it leaves it. So you'd say anywhere else in the world, the city would become a ghost town. Everybody would leave, that would be the end of it, but not Shanghai. Because the great story of Shanghai, I think, is although it's a product of imperialism, won in the Opium Wars by Britain largely from China and created as this split off piece of territory, in sort of violence and cruelty, it becomes a place of refuge. I mean, first of all, it becomes a place of refuge for the Chinese, escaping the Taiping Rebellion, flood, famine, disease, warlords, censorship, right? So it becomes a city that the Chinese go to because it's easier to do business there, but also there's less restrictions on them. So that's why we see Lao She, Lu Xun, Ba Jin, and the great modernist left-wing writers of China living in Shanghai. It's why all the great newspapers were in Shanghai, registered in the international settlement to avoid censorship elsewhere. It's why the movie industry of China is in Shanghai. And it's also, of course, why the Communist Party of China is formed in the French concession of Shanghai, right? Because if they'd been anywhere else, they'd have rounded them all up and cut their heads off, right? But they didn't, so they were able to do it in Shanghai. And then, of course, after 1917, Shanghai becomes home to 30,000 Russians who don't want to live with the Bolsheviks, the white Russians or the Russian emigres. When we were translating Midnight Peking originally into Chinese, the translator called me out. And it's quite nice. Normally, like I do a Portuguese edition, I mean, it's 16 languages or something. I do a Portuguese or a Norwegian edition, and the translator phones me up, and I'm like, I really can't help you, right? Like my Norwegian is middling to poor, basically, right? So I can't do much for you. And but with the Chinese one, I could sort of work with them a bit. And he phoned me up and he said, I've got this real problem. You keep using this term, white Russians. The white Russians did this, the white Russians did that. He says, I've been on Google, or because it was China, I've been on Bing or whatever they use up there, and I can't find any black Russians. Can't find any black Russians. All Russians appear to be white on the internet, right? So why do you keep using this term, right? Why do you keep using this term? And I said, well, it's white as opposed to red, not white as opposed to black. So so we sort of found a way to get around that. But there's 30,000 of them in Shanghai. And then, of course, by the time I'm writing about 1937, 1938, 1939, particularly after Kristallnacht in Europe, we get another 25, perhaps 30,000 European Jews, largely from Germany and Austria, escaping fascism in Europe. So we've got all of that, plus we've got all of these gangsters coming from all over the place who are just one step ahead of the law, and they all come to Shanghai as well. And then we've got all the other foreigners living there who, even if they're not technically gangsters and are not technically refugees, are just out to make a buck any way they can, because Shanghai is that kind of town. But the point is, even after the Japanese have invaded everywhere, none of these people can leave, right? If you're Russian, you haven't got a passport, you've got nowhere to go, and you can't get in anywhere. If you're Jewish, even if you came before the persecution of the Jews in Europe, like Joe came in 1929, when he goes to the Austrian embassy now, it's controlled by the Germans, and he can't get a new passport because he's Jewish. So he becomes a stateless citizen as well. So these people have nowhere to go. The only thing they can do is stay and try and make the best of it. And there's still a lot of money going through Shanghai, because particularly as we get to 1939, all of the Brits and everything were told, don't come home and join the war. You need to stay in Shanghai because we need all of this stuff, whether it's tungsten, wolfram, rubber, whatever. Our traditional markets are shut off because of the Nazis. We need you to ship as much as possible. Your war effort will be to stay in Shanghai and ship us as much commodities as you can get down to Hong Kong, across to Singapore, and somehow back to Europe. So That's why Shanghai survives when it shouldn't have survived. And that's why these guys are able to open a casino. And it was an incredible casino. As I say, 7 floors, 5 floors of gambling. Now, you could use cash, you could use Chinese money if you wanted to, but by that point, inflation is so crazy that an entire box of cash like that is just about enough to buy you some cigarettes or something. Right? So basically, they're doing it on gold, they're doing it on diamonds, women are selling their pearls. I mean, it's like a pawn shop come casino. But everybody is in the last chance saloon and everybody is spinning the wheel, hoping that this might get them the money to get out of the country, or at least to survive for a little bit longer. And of course, this all, as all of my books do, they kind of crash towards an inevitable historical moment that you can't get away from. You know, in Midnight in Peking, that first of all, there will be problems in July 1937 when the Japanese involved, and then even when you're carrying on the investigation after 1941, people will be interned. And in City of Devils, you know it can't go on beyond the 8th of December in Asia, not the 7th, when Pearl Harbor happens, because the Japanese will take over the entire city. So it's not a question of what will happen, it's just a question of who gets out, who's alive, and who doesn't get out alive, and how do they manage to do it. So that's what I did. And then in between, I kept doing various other little bits and pieces in journals and other stuff, including Bloody Saturday, which is of course all about August the 14th, 1937, which was the attack on Shanghai, and which has been we just passed the 80th anniversary of that, obviously, and it's been rather difficult to, no one else was going to do a book on Bloody Saturday, because if you know the story of Bloody Saturday, it is that the Japanese had their cruiser, their big battleships in the Huangpu River, and they were shelling into Baoshan and Jiabei, and the Chinese Air Force came in to try and take them out. But if you know that central part of Shanghai with the Bund and everything, it's a very narrow area, very small area. The Chinese pilots missed. One bomb fell in front of the Cathay Hotel, now the Peace Hotel, and the other one fell just over at the Dashijie, the Great World, over at in the French concession. And at that time, it was the biggest death by aerial bombardment that the world had ever seen. It was far, the death toll was 7,000. It was far higher than Guernica. And of course, we were still a few years away from the bombing of Chongqing, and then of course the Blitz on London and the British cities and so on. So it's a very difficult one for even, you know, nationalistic China to deal with, because it's like, it happens because the Japanese attacked, but it's also a kind of screw up by, well, the Kuomintang Air Force. So I wanted to tell that story through different perspectives on that day. So, and then, so again, this was an attempt to take Shanghai out to the world. And I realized when I was going around talking about Midnight in Peking everywhere, that as soon as people said the inevitable question, what are you working on next? And you say, oh, Shanghai, 1930s, you could just see light bulbs going off in a way that you don't with Peking. You could see it. You could see, oh, Cheongsams, jazz, fast cars, cool nightclubs. But I also wanted people to understand that in 1940, the Shanghai Municipal Council picked up, 13,500 dead bodies off the street of Shanghai. Unwanted babies, suicides, the highest suicide rate in the world. Russians who just couldn't find a way to make a living, people who died of the cold. When you fell through the cracks in old Shanghai, you really fell all the way to the bottom. There was no safety net. When you lived the high life, it was as high as life got, right? And it was those two extremes, and that I wanted to show as well. So that kind of worked a little bit as well. But then I thought, I'll go back to the start again with this book, and I'll go and contact Pete Spurrier, the mad independent publisher in Hong Kong. And I thought, I want to tell some stories that maybe don't interest everybody around the world, but will interest people who are interested in the region and China, about people who went to Shanghai, the foreigners that went to Shanghai. And some of them will be famous and are famous, but maybe you don't know they went to Shanghai and spent time there. Eugene O'Neill, who went in 1928 and had a mental breakdown in Shanghai with his lover. Langston Hughes, the Harlem Renaissance poet, who went to Shanghai and was followed everywhere because he was considered probably a spy for the Russians, but loved it because he was away from segregation era America. Who else is in there? Arthur Ransom, who most people know for Swallows and Amazons. But of course, before that, I mean, most people know Swallows and Amazons, right? The children's stories by Arthur Ransome. But most people don't know that before that, he was quite a committed socialist and was a reporter for the Manchester Guardian. And that he went to the Soviet Union and he fell in love with a Russian woman. And Arthur Ransome was about yay high. And the woman he fell in love with was my height. She actually an inch taller than me. She towered over him. And she was called Yevgenia Petrovna. And it so happened, which is a great one for a journalist, if you're going to fall in love with someone and you're reporting Russia, this is who you fall in love with in 1919, right? She was Trotsky's secretary, right? So he fell in love with Trotsky's secretary, and Trotsky's secretary fell in love with him. So they sort of embarked on this world tour together to go and report about China. And there's so much good information about it because British intelligence were following Arthur Ransome everywhere he went. Because it was rumoured that Yevgenia Petrovna was not just in love with a socialistic Englishman. They weren't too worried about Arthur Ransome, you know, in the way that the Secret Service are probably not that worried about Jeremy Corbyn, right? It was just sort of well-meaning lefty kind of worry, right? And but what they were worried was that Yevgenia was smuggling diamonds in her knickers. This is actually in the records. That they were in her knickers. And she was, as they went around the world, she was dropping off a few diamonds to all these communist agents everywhere. And of course, they ended up in Shanghai in 1927 when Chiang Kai-shek was suppressing the left very brutally in Shanghai. And they were worried that she was dropping off a few diamonds to the nascent Communist Party there. And then they were moving on back to England. But he wrote a very excellent piece called about the Shanghai Mind, which if you like me, had to live in Shanghai for a long time. If you've ever spent any time in Shanghai, you'll know that Shanghai Mind still exists. Go to an AmCham or a BritCham or an EU-Cham in Shanghai, and you'll still get the Shanghai Mind, which is, this is the most important place on earth. Nowhere understands money and business as well as us here, right? And though we pay no taxes back to the UK or anywhere else, you should support us with gunboats if necessary, right? You know, this was the Shanghai Mind, and it still exists. You'll still get it. So Arthur Ransome, yes. So whether or not she ever had any diamonds in her knickers was never established. The only person who knows that is Arthur Ransome, obviously, because he was literally in her knickers the whole time around. So he knew. But unfortunately, yeah, I mean, they actually did come back to England, get married, and they died within 6 months of each other in a lovely little cottage up in the Lake District, actually. Mm-hmm. And she was never done for anything. Who else is in here? Other people that you may not know came to Shanghai, but I think are very important. Louis L'Amour, if you ever read Westerns, right? Yes, of course, Zane Grey. After that, probably Louis L'Amour is the greatest writer of Westerns from America. He, as a merchant seaman and amateur boxer, came to Shanghai and decided to get off the boat in Shanghai and worked as a kind of sideshow boxer in a nightclub where they would have dancing and the chorus line. I mean, this is the mid-1920s. Shanghai's way on top of everything already. And halfway through, they would move the stage back and bring out a boxing ring. And two guys would go at each other for a while. And the whole skill was to kind of not be too brutal, so you put people off their dinner, but like put up a good fight, you know, but not completely cover the audience with blood, kind of as you did it. So he came, and he wrote 3 wonderful short stories, which you can find in his collections about Shanghai. And one of them is really about a true story, and no one's ever sort of noticed this before, because everyone who wrote about Louis L'Amour's short stories wrote about him as an American writer or a writer of Westerns. But looking at it from a sinology or Chinese history perspective, he wrote a great one about a man who, as many men did in the sort of 1920s and so on, fell in love with one of these gorgeous Russians that had turned up in Shanghai. And he was selling guns to the northern warlords at the time. And he had done a very good business with them, selling guns. And he was going to sell another load. But he decided, I've got to get out of Shanghai because the Russian girlfriend wants to go, and we're going to go and be in love and everything. So he decided, as they trusted him, to send a boat up the Yangtze to the warlords with all the crates of guns. But he just put 2 guns on top, and underneath he just put a lot of lead pipe. And they had already paid him. So he had the money, and he sent lead pipe up to the warlords, thinking, we'll get on the boat tonight. But his girlfriend, the Russian girl, says, I cannot get on the boat tonight because there's this really great party going on, and I have to go to this party because it's like the party of the year in Shanghai, and I have to be there, right? And he's like, no, we've got to get the boat. And she's like, there's a boat next week. don't worry about it. It doesn't make a big deal. He's like, no, we really have to get this boat. Anyway, of course, he loses the argument. He decides, I'll probably be okay. And he goes to the party. Well, Louis L'Amour lived in the same apartment building in Shanghai as him. And when he came back in the morning from his boxing gig, outside was a large crowd and gathered around looking slightly shocked. And outside the apartment building was set in the earth around a tree stump was a piece of the lead pipe with the head of the guy. Now, that's always been read by people as a fictional story, but it's actually a true story of what happened to an American arms dealer in China at the time. Louis L'Amour was actually in there. So he was very good. Warner Oland, by the way, I just should tell you a few more of these. Warner Oland, who is the man who played Charlie Chan in all the movies. And the Chinese were always, quite rightly, very worried about yellowface and white actors playing Chinese and derogatory portrayals of Chinese. But when Warner Oland came to Shanghai, they mobbed him. They loved him because they weren't quite sure if he wasn't Chinese, because he was Swedish. And he kind of told the newspapers that maybe he was Chinese, or maybe there was a bit of Mongolian in him and things like that. He also claimed that there was lots of pictures of him, I have some in the book, having Gung Bao Ji Ding and everything in the film studios and everything, you know. And he would say, I'm learning Chinese. And throughout his career, if you track it on the newspapers, he always says, I'm learning Chinese. He never actually speaks any or says any, but he just says he is, right? And he turns up in Shanghai and he's got the sort of, not Fu Manchu, he's got the sort of Charlie Chan moustache. And he actually starts speaking like Charlie Chan. So all the Chinese journalists rush down and they say, what is it like to be in China, Mr. Oland? And he says, Oland come China, feel very happy to be in ancient land and things like that. And of course, the Chinese journalists lap up this kind of Charlie Chanism. And the government, the nationalist government, actually thought the movies were good because what they showed was a kind of a teetotal, intellectual, crime-solving family man, you know, number one son and all of that, right? And they felt this was a good portrayal of the Chinese. So he was actually feted wherever he went. And in fact, the mayor of Shanghai threw a banquet for him and gave him a moustache comb. Gave him a moustache comb, which is a nice gift to be given, isn't it? Yes, so I sort of did those, and there were a few others that maybe you know or maybe you don't know. I mean, I put Aleister Crowley in there. People who know anything about the occult, the British occult tradition, will know about Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley is the first example that I know of someone who came all the way to China just to try and get a shag. There was a woman who had been an admirer of him, and he had contacted her. He was known as the Beast 666, right? And she had been in his occult thing. She moved to Hong Kong, and they said that they would meet every night. She moved to Shanghai later, but she was mostly in Hong Kong. They would meet every Saturday night at 7 p.m. on the astral plane and make love, right? So when I went through this, I went through all the records that I could find of this, both her letters and his letters to each other. And it's like 7 o'clock Saturday, we meet on the astral plane where we will make love, right? And I suddenly realized when I'm halfway through this, because then he decides to come to Shanghai where she's moved, because he says, the astral plane thing's all right, you know, but I'm kind of thinking maybe we should sort of do it for real, right? And when I worked it out, that at no point do they ever mention the time difference, right? They never mention the time difference. So my theory is the reason the astral plane sex didn't work was that 7 o'clock Hong Kong time, there she was lying on her bed going, Aleister, I'm on the astral plane, take me, right? And of course, you know, he wasn't even up yet, right? And then 7 o'clock at night, he rushes back from the pub, gets his kit off and lies on the bed going, right, I'm ready to go. And she's like, it's 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. And as you know, no one likes to be woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning for sex. So I think that's why it didn't work. So he came to Shanghai, all the way to Shanghai, and he didn't come the easy way. He didn't come on a boat. He came to Indochina and then walked up across mountains and then down through Kunming and everything. He walked all the way, right? Now this is a man who is desperate for a shag. Right? If you walk all the way from Kunming to Shanghai, right, just try to sit with her. And when he got there, she said, no, basically. She said no. So it was all a bit of a disaster. So some of these stories are a bit damp squid. I'm afraid he never got to sleep with her. She'd gone off him by the time he got there. So that was a bit weird. There's a few others people may know. Who am I trying to think of? Oh, Penelope Fitzgerald. She's the last one in the book, really. Penelope Fitzgerald. Not a lot of people know this. I only knew because someone told me that they'd been researching her and they'd found this this notebook in her archive, and they said to me, "You really have to go and look at this notebook." And what it is, when you open it from the back, it's the first 30, 40 pages of her great novel, The Bookshop, which is, you know, the book she's best known for, all about a small English town and the petty jealousies and someone trying to run a bookshop, right? As you know, all troublesome customers, local officials, all the rest of it, right? But the person said to me, that's at the back, and that's what all the scholars look at, that she started writing it in this notebook and how it differs from the final text. That's what literary scholars like. Said, flip it round. It's her diary of a trip to China in 1977. She came to Shanghai and Beijing in 1977 on the first ever British package holiday to China that Thompson's, the package holiday people, organised. And she came, and she'd been around Beijing and then around Shanghai, and she was so fed up. You know how organised these tours are now. Imagine what they were like in 1977. She was so fed up, and she wasn't allowed to leave the hotel, and she couldn't sleep because of the steam heating and everything, that she just flipped her diary around and started writing The Bookshop in the back of it. And so that was where that book was created. But then there's a load of people that no one will know that I wanted to write about. Lida Roberti was a Hollywood star in comedy movies, and she was born as a Russian emigre in Shanghai, but went there. And I did a lot of work on a woman called Lily Flor, who I'm fascinated by. And again, I mean, my sort of final point is really, everyone still sends me things. So Lily Flor was Jewish from Vienna. She was in a family act that was in the Yiddish music hall in Vienna. And then she became a star of the silent movies in Berlin. She was a sort of comedy actress in silent movies. 1934, she's not allowed to work in the movies anymore because she's Jewish and the Nazi proscription. She comes to Shanghai because her husband does a bit of business here, there. So she goes to Shanghai, and she becomes a sort of singer in nightclubs in Shanghai. And then, because she's there before the Jewish refugees, when the Jewish refugee comes, she does lots of charity work to raise money for the Jewish refugees. At some point, she loses the original husband, marries another husband. And after the war, she moved to Sydney, Australia, and just never performed again. She just became a housewife down in Sydney, which is quite common, actually. You get lots of them that were showgirls and things like that, and they marry and then go to somewhere like Sydney or Oxford or somewhere, and they never sort of do anything again. But since I did that, which I was hoping would happen with this book, I've had lots of people contact me to say, oh, my mum's got a program. She lived in Shanghai in the war, and she's got a program for a performance she did. Or even someone just sent me a poster for a performance that she did. So things like that come out. And I've got various other things in there. I also did a big thing on the Gypsy Roma community of Shanghai. No one's ever researched the Roma in Shanghai before, but I found out that there were about 300 Romani people in Shanghai, mostly engaged in the entertainment industry, because that sort of gypsy jazz was very popular in the 1930s. But they were never recorded properly because most of them had come from Russia. So they were recorded as Russians, and there was no sort of subdivision. I mean, you know, actually, although we have 25, 30,000 Jewish refugees in there, about 20% of the Russian exodus was also Jewish. So, you know, but they're always counted as Russians rather than Jews as such. So we have those kind of things. And I did a big piece on Elie the Swiss, who I'm very fond of, Elie the Swiss. And he was a Swiss gangster. It does sound silly, doesn't it, a Swiss gangster? He was a Swiss gangster in Shanghai. And there's some great photos of him, like kind of Ocean's 11 type pictures of all of that family. And he policeman going bang, and he has to take one in the chest in order to finish the deal, to prove, because they weren't going to take it on trust that these things worked. Huh?
For every vest?
No, they just did it for one vest. Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Yeah. So So he was in there. Now, I had been told a story that when he was in Shanghai in about 1942, he was actually finally arrested by the Japanese, who got fed up of him, because he was Swiss, so he's neutral. But they finally got fed up of him, and they arrested him and threw him in Bridge House, which was the Japanese torture chamber in Shanghai. And he was in there with the Doolittle Raiders, the Americans that flew the missions to bomb Japan, bomb Tokyo, when the Japanese thought they were safe and that the American pilots couldn't get that far. But they didn't have enough petrol to get back to their base, so they bailed out all across China, and a number of them were captured and taken to Shanghai and Bridge House. He was in there, and I'd heard a rumor that after he got out of there, he, who by then was in his 50s, married an 18-year-old Russian girl, and that somehow they managed to get out and go to America. And I'd never been able to follow that story through. I'd found a various branch of the family who gave me some photos, but I never found that core family. And literally 2 nights ago, when I was first came down here and stayed in Gary's house, after Gary had given me some pizza and got me pretty drunk, he sent me off to bed. And I literally got a Facebook message from someone who said, "Are you the guy writing about Ellie the Swiss Whittler?" And when I'm the daughter from the second marriage of the 18-year-old girl that you say he married. She's now 90 something or other, and she'd love to talk to you, and we're going to have a phone conversation. Oh, wow. So she's still alive, and she is like, for me now, to find someone who was a witness to, like, 1940 Shanghai is like getting really, really difficult to find anyone like that. But just because of this, she was only 18 in that, so she's still around. So I'm going to talk to her. And I said, like, okay, I've got to do an event on Sunday. But Monday I need to talk to you, because I thought, like, because I've had this happen to me before, that you say, like, oh, I'm a bit busy this month, I'll talk to you next month, and you get an email saying, they're not there. I mean, one of the women in this book, who's absolutely fantastic white Russian dancer, I was in long conversations with her. She sent me loads of great pictures of her in Peking performing, all dressed up like Dietrich and everything. And I had so many questions for her, and then I just got an email one day from her daughter saying she passed away in the night, kind of thing. So, they're dying. And the other thing I would say to you, in case you're interested in, if you have things that you come across, is the other big problem we've got at the moment is photographs. So, of course, we have lots of photographs of old Shanghai and Beijing, and Hong Kong as well, because they were done as tintypes or whatever. But as soon as the Kodak paper comes in, we get lots of photos, which I have in all of the books, of people in nightclubs, and it's just snap, snap, here we all are, right? That paper has a 70-year life. So that paper is now starting to disintegrate. And I've already had people who say, oh, I've got a biscuit tin up in the roof with photos in, and they're going up and it's just, the pictures have just disintegrated. So if they haven't scanned them in and photographed them, and of course that kind of paper, the slightest bit of damp or anything like that just destroys it. So we actually are like now in a position where we're starting to lose photographs if people have them in the attic and haven't quite dug them out yet. So so for me, to finish up, that's all of these stories are great, and I wanted to do this one with Pete because I thought what I'll do with Pete is this hopefully is of interest to people here in China, and we'll do this one, and then I'm just trying to finish now another one called Destination Peking, which will be 18 stories of foreigners, famous and not so famous, and a few gangsters that went to Peking, and I hope to do Singapore and Hong Kong, because I have some stories on Singapore and even Hong Kong. So I want to do it, and then we can just do 4 of them, and hopefully that will keep Pete in Qingdao for a little bit. So and make me a bit of money as well. So yeah, so the most wonderful thing about all of these I've found, because I just work on this kind of subject area, is I've kind of now become the sort of go-to guy on the internet for these things, and I'm getting emails on a sort of almost daily basis, certainly on a weekly basis, from people who are like, my grandmother or my mother lived at 93 Carter Road, Shanghai. What's that address now? Is that house still there? And I'm just like, well, I can tell you that, but have you got any photos? Have you got any paperwork? Have you got any documents or whatever? Because we need to do this let's do a little trade, right? Send me your photos and I'll send you the information. And I'm getting that so regularly now. And I get it a little bit from Hong Kong, though I'm obviously not so associated with Hong Kong. But I definitely get it from people who were up in China all the time. And that's just giving me so much material and adding so much to everything. So if you're interested in that sort of stuff, my blog at chinarhyming.com, when I get stuff like that, I tend to just put it up on the blog, partly as an aid memoir to myself so I don't forget it, and it gives me a searchable database, but I just put lots of stuff up, and adverts for shops and everything like that, for shops in old Shanghai and Beijing, not like welcome supermarkets, up on the site. So that for me is the greatest thing, is that every day when I get up and switch my email on now, I kind of am getting stuff from people who are getting in contact. Oh, I knew so and so, or my dad lived down the road from that person, and so it's kind of I'm kind of building up this enormous database of old Shanghaiers and old Pekingers. But hopefully people down here like it, or even though it's about up there. And to just reiterate, to finish where we started, support your local bookshop, because it's where you find all these things. But thank you so much for coming out on a Sunday. That's wonderful. Thank you.